Yeah, so this is a pretty long paper. It's 25 pages, and we're going to try to, obviously I can't compress it into a 15-minute presentation, so there'll be some things that are not discussed in the presentation, and I recommend and I highly encourage you to actually read the paper. Okay, so this is an SoK for censorship-resistant systems. It's with my co-authors Sherbano Katak, who couldn't be here, unfortunately, and some other co-authors at Laurent Colleen, Stephen Murdoch, and Ian Goldberg, who are over here. Okay, so just to motivate for the need for a censorship-resistant system, SoK, what we found is that there's a lot of censorship-resistant systems, and you will see some more being presented today. And we were wondering, like, are there, like, what is their key, functionality that they provide? What makes them different? And so we see that, maybe it's not the case that they all provide the same, provide for the same use cases. They may have different properties, and that enables different use cases. There's general censorship-resistant systems, for instance, Tor with bridges and pluggable transports, and niche resistant systems that are only useful for particular scenarios and not useful for normal like web browsing. So what we did is we extracted some common censorship apparatus and CRS elements, the properties and techniques, and what we wanted to do was see if we could provide some valuable insights, and I think that we have reached something like that, which we'll provide at the end. The aims of this talk is to, again, like I said, it's just a very small subset of what's actually in the paper, so I just wanted to highlight the abstract model that we use for the censorship apparatus and the CRS design. Highlight the fact that it's an arms race. I'll show that by also presenting the common techniques that have been deployed, have been used by CRS systems, and to shine some light on open problems and challenges that we have identified. So the first key thing that we note is that censorship has some sort of scale and scope. Most systems depend on the fact that there is a part of the planet where the censor does not exert any control. It is outside the scope of influence of the censor. That's the little fist that you see there. There's also the scope of visibility. These are the areas where the censor can see and observe, but cannot actually exert any control. Examples of this is where they might have cooperation with other countries that share data with them, but don't necessarily mean that they can actually go and make that country do anything to its citizens. So the size of these things is limited by some constraints that the censor has. I just mentioned some physical constraints, like geographical, where the censor cannot actively go to another sovereign nation and do anything there to its citizens. There's political. It may be the case that censorship is not such a palatable or appetizing notion for the civilians of that nation, and also for relations between countries. Some countries may not like to be presented as a censoring regime. So that's some political constraints that may be in place. There's economic constraints. On the one hand, economic constraints can be that it's just too expensive to conduct the level of censorship that the country would like. The other aspect of the economic side is that by censoring, it may hurt the economy of the country or have some other economic impact that is the direct effect of conducting that censorship. And finally, the technological, which is usually what we focus on. It's just, is it possible to even do that level of censorship? Okay, so these are some of the limitations that we have for the censor. Then, using those limitations, what we did is we modeled the censorship apparatus as an imperfect mechanism. The idea is that there's it is inherent to this mechanism some errors in the nature of false positives and false negatives. False positives being blocking things that should not have been blocked, and false negatives letting things go that should have actually been blocked. The little curve on the side shows us the tension between the censor and the circumventor. What the censor would like is to push the curve down to the bottom left corner, have no false positives and no false negatives, and it's the aim of the CRS systems to try to push it to the diagonal where the censor is basically unable to protect or prevent these errors when it tries to do censorship. The main tools for the censorship apparatus that we, in our SoK, we distill is that there's the fingerprinting type, which is it tries to learn as much as it can about censorship resistance traffic and activities, and direct action, what kind of censorship actions it can take, be it blocking, corruption, disruption, things of that nature. So I'd like to now move to the common CRS techniques and the arms race. I presented as a presented in from two directions. One is the address-based things that the sensor can do in terms of the address space, or where things exist on the network. The other one will be what it can do on the traffic layer, analysis of traffic. Okay, so initially in the address space, the first thing, and I want to present it as like not necessarily that this is how the arms race goes, but this is just one example of how the arms race can be presented. So the sensor starts blocking IP addresses of places that are serving censorship or content that is not something that the sensor would like their citizens to look at, or the people in their regime to look at. Or it can start corrupting DNS or other things that make it difficult to actually get to the website or service that is providing the censorship resistance, or sorry, censored content. So the first step, a very simple one and a low-hanging fruit, is just to deploy some sort of proxy, which is not yet blocked by the sensor because it has not been identified as something that provides censored content. So that's like usually the first step, and sometimes maybe sufficient in many regimes. Then the next step could be that, oh, we've discovered that this is what's happening. The sensor starts blocking the access points to this to the proxy service. Then the next step for the censorship resistance system is, okay, let's start hiding our IP addresses. Let's give them only to our friends. Let's start putting mechanisms in place that makes it hard for the sensor to go out and find these proxy addresses easily. An alternative to that is to have just no IP address for the sensor to actually block. Here I'll point out an example. Systems like decoy routing systems, they have this property that you don't block based on IP addresses, you have to block the whole route. A third one based on addresses that you could do is to use a popular service that the sensor would be loath to block because it would have too much fallout in terms of economics, in terms of political, and the other constraints that it has. So this is systems like use Google, Amazon, and things of that nature that are too big to attack, or the assumption is that they're too big to attack from the sensor's point of view. The sensor could then deploy sophisticated techniques to harvest the IP addresses from when you're trying to hide it from them. It could try to probe for those IP addresses by actively trying to detect these CRS systems operating on those IP addresses. For the place where there is no IP addresses, you could start avoiding the route. What you've done is you've just taken the fight to another level where you're like getting the adversary not to just block by destination, but by whole routes. And of course, on the final one, it could be that you did not assume correctly that the sensor would not block this popular service, and they go ahead and block it. And finally, on the side of where things haven't yet gotten blocked completely, to prevent the sensor from harvesting too aggressively, you could try to rate limit how you give out your IP addresses. You could have it that the IP addresses you use are only valid for a short period of time, so even if the sensor collects them, they're not worth that much in the long term. Damon has already pointed out there's just 5 minutes left, so I'm going to move on and just point out that I had this thing for traffic patterns, but again, there is an arms race here. If you look at the paper, you can read about the details of these various censorship resistance techniques that have been used and the attacks against them. What I really wanted to get to was the juice of it, was the open problems and trends. Okay, so the first thing we do is we question some common assumptions, revisit them. We wonder about the attack realism. So I showed that there was this escalating arms race, some of it is not that the censor is actually doing this. It's in the literature showing that these are attacks that are possible and what are the mitigations for it. So perhaps the censor is not willing to attack these high-cost distinguishers that we have identified. So, and also maybe what we're focusing on is academically challenging things versus what the censor actually is willing to do. So what we need is some empiricism in terms of measuring censors' capabilities and also what they're actually doing. There have been studies, but they're mostly snapshots in time and of particular geographical regions. What we'd like is something more large scale. Also, one of the assumptions about the whole scope is that maybe we have made a mistake in terms of making censor-resistant systems with very specific scope that we have an outside, like things like the Snow revelations shows us that perhaps the scope is much larger than we thought. And also this has implications for our assumptions on these countries will not collude and things like, oh, if I put my censor-resistant system in many different jurisdictions, they're not going to collude. So this kind of gets suspect as well. And finally, we always seem to think that the censor is some sort of static entity. We don't investigate the dynamic behavior that might be in play. We also don't look at how the censor behaves to information leakage. We always consider like how does it behave to collateral damage, like what is the defense that we can put up there. So in the paper at the end, if you stick around, I'll talk about these things. Here I wanted to point out that let's focus on collateral damage. It always seems like, oh, the more collateral damage you can get, the better it is. And the way to get really great amounts of collateral damage is perhaps to focus on really, really popular services and platforms. And the idea being it's going to be mutually assured destruction if the censor blocks us. Yeah, sure, we lose our censor resistance system, but it really, really would hurt the censor as well. And so this brinkmanship is some kind of equilibrium state. Also, happily, it allows us to develop our systems much faster, and we can leverage the engineering and infrastructure that's already in place with these popular services. And the idea of this kind of protection is intuitive and simple to understand. So as a con for these things, I think the censor can do things to avoid this collateral damage that we think we're going to impose on it. There are examples of where there's local alternatives to very popular services, which the local population is actually using. They don't actually go to this external website that you think is so too big to fail. And the censor is completely okay with blocking it. This could happen naturally because there's like language barriers, or because there's anti-competitive laws for external firms to actually establish themselves inside the country. There's of course political tactics. You can threaten the TP here is the third party or the popular service that you're leveraging. And they say, oh, you know what, censorship resistance people, please stop using our service for your purposes. We want to conduct business and only provide the services that are okay. And finally, it could be that the censor does not shut down these services. They just embrace and co-opt them and have them report and inform on the users, especially when the CRS is not actually providing any privacy protections on top. They're just maybe using the single hop proxy, and this popular service can see all the accesses, so it makes it a very nice target for coercion. So this avoiding the collateral damage, it makes this question like there is no outside that the censor, that the circumvention system can depend on, and we kind of no or less collateral damage than we thought. Also, it could be that we're bouncing on unsteady shoulders. We depend on the service provider to be stable, but this might just be a happy coincidence. The third party is not invested in the CRS's success. It could have an evolving design for their infrastructure. This has happened many times where the infrastructure is changed from under the CRS and the CRS functionality stops working. And it could, of course, cease operations altogether. Finally, there could be unexpected consequences. We thought that, oh, if you concentrate everything into one place, put all our eggs in one basket, and because of the mutually assured destruction thing, the censor is not going to attack you. But what this could do is provide a concentration point for the censor to really focus in on these particular services. It also reduces the unknowns for the censor. Like if you for instance, start using Google, they know exactly what Google service is supposed to behave like, and maybe they can develop better fingerprints. So I already mentioned that it can allow allows targeted attacks. And this escalates the arms race in this particular niche, and perhaps the returns are diminishing over time. Okay, so the key takeaways, I'll go in reverse. So reduce dependence on popular services. We'd like things to be more distributed, diverse, and have dedicated infrastructure that works for the CRS, not because it's a happy coincidence. Get ahead of that arms race I briefly highlighted there. We like to have privacy in the CRS design so that if you do have compromises, you don't have it give up the users of the CRS. And of course, we like to have designs or explore designs where the scope of influence and visibility is much larger than we thought it was. Thank you.